When Bard was overviewing the purpose of Huddle, he mentioned three things. He talked about trying to create understanding, and that's, I think, what the role of the panel is to do, is provide a little bit of an insight into one or two shards of the issue, and then to connect with each other. And so after we hear from the panel, we're going to get a chance to speak to one or two other people that are sitting beside you or that you either know or don't know, and you'll get a chance to kind of reflect back a little bit on what did you hear out of this panel. And then lastly, to foster action is the third thing I heard Bard say. And that this idea is that obviously we're in a time where there are a lot of very profound issues facing us. They can fit into the category of sustainability, but there are also many ways to slice the cake. And regardless of what issue is your passion is oriented towards, there is plenty of room for taking action in this world. And so hopefully this conversation will help to inspire a little bit more clarity for yourself about the things that you can do and take on in your own lives. So that's what we're hoping to do today, is to build understanding, connect with each other, and to act. So we'll hear from the panel. Everybody in the panel, you've got about 3 to 5 minutes. I've got a little timer that hopefully I have enough batteries for, and it'll go off at 4 minutes. And so that means just make sure you're wrapping up if you're still speaking at that time. And what I'm inviting you to speak about, and you probably have already thought about this, but just to get, so that we have some continuity, is to really think about the question that was on the slide before, which was, how does diversity affect collective mobilization in protecting the environment? So we're talking about diversity working together in a collective and then protecting the environment. So I look forward to hearing from you. And I think you all have microphones. So we'll first be hearing from Arzeena and then by Claudia. So Arzeena, please.
Okay, thanks. Everyone can hear me okay? So my work in Richmond is quite broad. As a coordinator of the Food Security Society, I'm trying to do a lot of work on the whole range of food security, from growing more food locally to getting people to change their purchasing habits so that they support more local growers, to learning how to can and process local food so that they can eat through the winter, to composting. So, it's a kind of a huge range of activities and things that we do. And I first of all want to say we love the cultural diversity. I love the cultural diversity of Richmond. I grew up there since 1970. So it's quite a wonderful reflection of how different cultures can live together quite harmoniously. Now, so I want to first of all say that, because we work with every culture right now in Richmond. But if we want to concentrate on sort of the answer or the question that's been given us, where have some of the challenges been? I think probably one area of challenge has been around supporting people to make changes in their food choices at home. I think if any of you have come from another culture, one of the last things that changes, after you learn the language of where you are now moved from to now that you dress differently in different habits, food is always the last thing that people hang on to. And it's probably the hardest thing to change. So coming from an organization that's trying to get people to change certain habits, purchasing habits of food, can be quite an interesting challenge. And Bard, and Claudia were on a panel earlier this year around looking at the whole aspect of eating rice. And we chose rice because we thought that it's quite pan-Asian, and in fact, it's global. There are people from Latin America who eat rice, Africa who eat rice. And the question is, should we in Richmond, or in Canada, I should say, continue to eat rice, and what the global impact of those food choices have been? And I guess we kind of rocked the boat a bit. And you can imagine, we were trying to be as culturally sensitive as possible, but it's hard to balance being challenging without attacking someone's culture. And so, you have to tread really lightly when you're looking at trying to make change in that area. So, as someone who's not Chinese Canadian, but who's Indo-Canadian, I personally feel I at least have an into the Indo-Canadian community, and I can personally challenge some of the, say, food choices that Indo-Canadians make. I find it much harder to challenge other cultures' food choices. But I realize that as an outsider in that, from that culture, I can raise the question and I can support other people in those communities to make those changes. So, you know, there's no rule book on how to work in different cultures, and we're kind of seeing as we go along, and hopefully not making too many drastic mistakes, of how to work in such a culturally diverse community. Does that make sense?
So I work mainly in the Chinese community to promote awareness about shark fin issues. So I won't go too deep into the ecological and wastefulness aspects of shark finning. I'm pretty sure folks have a general sense of what it's about. So, you know, our main work is two parts. One is engaging consumers, so Chinese consumers, on better choices they can make around soups, because we have thousands of soups and it doesn't have to be shark fin. And two is promoting legislation to actually protect sharks, mainly right now that's around shark fin bans. So I think that's an interesting place to take the conversation, because there's been a lot of dynamics. So in terms of the first part of the work, the consumer engagement, we do two things. We not only educate the Chinese consumer, but we also do what we call intercultural awareness. And so that means educating communities that aren't Chinese about why we eat shark fin, and you know, whether or not it's a tradition, to reduce any potential, you know, opportunities for xenophobia, because in a lot of the Western media, I don't think they had the intentions to do this, but in a lot of Western media, the issue around shark fin comes out kind of xenophobic. So pointing fingers, saying, you know, Chinese people are disgusting, why do you do this? Versus asking us the question, you know, tell me more about your culture. And so that's the other area of work that we do, is this intercultural awareness. And around the shark fin ban specifically, there's been an interesting dynamic where this animosity that's been created in the media has carried forth into opposition. So a lot of associations, Chinese business associations and restaurant communities come out saying this is an attack on our culture. And you know, I don't have statistics to prove it, but I feel like some of the reason is because they see that in the media, that's how it's framed. And so when they're asked whether or not they support things like shark fin bans, that's how they respond. And to be honest, I understand where they come from, because apparently, according to one of my Caucasian friends, she asked me like 5 years ago if I drank shark fin, and she said she didn't ask it in a very nice way. And she said that I responded in defense, saying, so what, this is what I do, don't tell me what to do. But I don't remember this, so, but apparently I did it. So I understand where that defense comes from. That's one issue, is around the intercultural work. The second thing is that, you know, within the Chinese culture, there's so many aspects we have to consider. It's you know, traditionally quite a high power dynamic culture. So if you're young, you don't get taken as seriously. If you're a young female, that kind of even, you know, lowers you on the totem pole, so to speak. So there's those dynamics we have to play with. And you know, within the Chinese language, there's so many dialects. So a funny story that I share is that, you know, the Vancouver City organized this event where they invited 30 Chinese Canadian leaders from around Vancouver to talk about sustainability issues. And we're all speaking in English, but we all don't really understand each other, because some people have heavy Mandarin accents, some people have heavy Cantonese accents, and some people don't understand those accents and just speak you know, good English like me, because I'm born here. So even with that, that's difficult. And so then when you're looking at, you know, creating something as simple as a fact sheet, you have it in English, you have it in traditional Chinese, you have it in simplified Chinese. And even if you write it in traditional Chinese, you have to consider, you know, Cantonese versus Taiwanese traditional Chinese. So that, in terms of our communications work, has been kind of tough. So I hear the ringer went off. So not only do I talk loud, but I talk a lot. So I'll just leave that. I think I'll just leave it at that. And yeah, and thank you so much to ACCO for organizing this. I think it's a really important conversation to have. So yeah.
Fairchild TV, I first introduced my organization. Fairchild TV is a Chinese language television, and we're broadcasting 2 languages, one in Cantonese with Fairchild Television and television in Mandarin language, which is another dialect. And as a journalist, like my role as a journalist, we report on what is happening out there. So we usually listen, try not to be judgmental, and keep an open mind, and report on like different voices. And with this forum, it's about like how diversity affects collective mobilization. When it comes to diversity, like as a journalist, diversity we would think of it as like minority voices. And when these diversity of minority voices come together, it is not minority anymore. And so what is not newsworthy before might become newsworthy. Because Chinese language media is like ethnic media, as we call it, and there's like mainstream media. We did have like different focus sometimes because we have to take care of our audiences. And being culturally sensitive, like it is what we're more concerned about. When it comes to environmental reporting, I'm not an environmental journalist, but in general, when it comes to reporting on environmental issues, it is not about culture, but it is about newsworthiness, I would say. And what is newsworthy? It has to be like, it affects daily lives of people. It affects maybe they're interested in maybe money. It costs them more, like the hydro bills cost them more, then we'll report on it because our audiences will be interested. And when it affects safety, and let's say food safety, or when it affects like certain community groups' land, their like connection with their land, then we will report on it. But it has to be of interest to our community too, right? And this is the community that we report on and for. Okay, and what I want to say is when these minority voices come together and they're not minorities anymore, and the debate will happen, right? So everybody will have an opportunity to maybe take a step back, and then we're just giving voice to different stakeholders so they can think about whether the decisions that they made, the future decisions that they want to make, or some of the people who are passionate about the cause that they're pursuing for, like what would be the long-term impacts, cost and benefits that they can do. And because I would believe that everybody who are outspoken, who are out there to, like Claudia, you're pursuing for certain, you are like very passionate for the cause that you are pursuing, and I guess every panelist here too. And then we can just take a step back and review all the decisions that we want to make in the present and maybe in the future too.
When I started working in nutrition, I thought that it's one thing to tell people, go eat healthy food, go to the store, buy broccoli, but how do we really engage youth, and how do we engage the community in the process, in being healthy? And I thought that it made sense to get them involved in the process of being healthy, which means understanding the seat-to-table process, what the process of getting food to the plate. And I really wanted to work with diverse groups of people because we live in a diverse city where there's all different cultures. And when I looked back, when I started studying different cultures, backgrounds, and different traditional backgrounds, it just became really obvious that traditionally most of us were healthy. Like if we look at the Mayan tradition, or we look at the First Nations tradition of eating and how they gathered or brought their food to their plate, it was all natural. They intuitively knew how to preserve the food or how to make their food more nutritious. Like for instance, in the Indian culture, a lot of things are fermented first. All the beans are fermented. Same with the Chinese and a lot of the Asian, natto, miso, different types of food are naturally healthier because that's what they did traditionally. And so what happened over time was that we became more Europeanized, more North Americanized, and we started eating unhealthy, not preparing our foods, and really losing the cultural connection to our food. So I took the project idea that I had as an opportunity to engage people in different traditional cultures and get them educated. One of the challenges has been to actually get people out to a garden site and just to educate them on what urban agriculture means, that it means growing food in the city. And so we had to do creative things, come up with creative ideas on how to get people out. We just recently had a harvest celebration where we brought the world to the world in a garden, and we had different workshops, and we had one of them was there's a Mayan garden at the UBC farm, and so we brought them out, and they talked about their tradition of food and the three sisters, which is corn and beans and squash, and how they traditionally prepared it, and the importance that it had to the land and the earth, and how we've really, because we've lost such a simple connection, which is that we have with food, which is connected to the earth, we've lost, like, we don't even think about the environmental impacts of our food choices. So I find when we have a couple of hundred people to events like these, and we have people that are actually working with the land through food, that it's an easy way to engage people. It's just getting them out there in the first place, but it's an easy way to engage them because food affects all of us. And we basically use food as a vehicle to bring people together. It's something that we all have in common, no matter what culture we're from. And it's a way we can really start to appreciate and say, hey, you know, maybe I'm Chinese and you're Japanese, but look at, fermentation is something that traditional cultures have done for many, many years, and maybe it's different foods, and maybe we have different culture, traditions around it, but you know, it's something we all have in common. And so I find that food is a way to not only nourish ourselves, our physical bodies, but to nourish our community, and that when that people are really interested. You know, as a nutritionist, people, as soon as I never say I'm a nutritionist at the dinner table, because then I get 1,000 questions about what kind of food they should be eating, and hey, I have this problem, and so because people actually are interested, it's something that affects all of us, and we don't, because we're not connected to the land, we don't think about how our food choices affect the land, but they do, and I just found that creating the physical site of the garden has really helped to engage people in the process that brings food to their plate, as I said before. So, thank you.
As an academic, I've worked in a very interesting kind of perspective. I am ethnically diverse. I'm from 3 different cultures. I'm also trained in a diverse way. I'm originally a chemical engineer, and then I have an MBA, and then I have a PhD in environmental studies, which is the social science and political science and geography. So I've had diversity in the way I've formed myself and the way I'm trained. But also, it's interesting in hearing the panel because I am, again, diverse in what I study. What I study is water and toxics, and I study the politics of governing water and toxics. And I've spent the last 10 years of my life trying to understand and study collective mobilization, but when I was trying to sieve my research and refine it into the simplest 3 things that I do is I look at environmental governance from a cultural perspective, and I'm currently doing a project on understanding how different people use water and drink water. For example, there are Latino people using and drinking tap water more or less than, for example, people from that are Indo-Canadian or people that are Chinese-Canadian. I look at issues of issue diversity. So where people are very concerned about scarcity of water, I am more concerned with pollution of water, with wastewater. So I try to look at things from a perspective of those things that nobody else is looking at. So if everybody is looking at scarcity of water, then I go and I look at wastewater, simply because I think that there is a need for diversity in what we do for research. And one of my projects actually has looked at mobilization, how environmental NGOs mobilize around toxics and how different their mobilization around toxics is with regards to water. And finally, I look at nationality, and I separate culture from nationality because you can have one nationality and have a lot of different diverse cultures within that nationality at the subnational level. So when I look comparatively, I'm a comparativist by training, and I look at how environmental NGOs respond, national governments respond to the mobilization of NGOs. So after telling you all of that, I like to I'm a professor, so I like to summarize things, and I'm going to summarize what I've learned in my decade of research. And what I've learned is, in a context of cultural diversity, the mobilization of environmental movements can be successful, and will be successful. The success will be dependent on how the movement can galvanize different target audiences. And therefore, you should be able to pinpoint what the exact issue is. So for example, in my case, I study toxics. And toxics are an area that a lot of people are interested because it affects them. I don't want my children to be drinking from a baby bottle, from a formula bottle that may have bisphenol BPA, for example. So people respond to that, but people don't respond as fast when you have issues, for example, of forestry, where, yes, of course, we're concerned about the Great Bear Rainforest, but what happens with, cutting down the trees down in the South Campus of the University of British Columbia, for example? What happens, how that affects our population? So yes, the success of an environmental campaign will be dependent on identifying within a context of diversity where there is direct impact on human health or on what is relevant to an individual. And the second one, before I run out of time, is in the context of diversity. And diversity understood not only as cultural diversity, but issue diversity. People will tend to gravitate, and environmental movements, collective mobilizations, will tend to gravitate to movements where they can find affinity. So diversity is great, but you need to have that particular point of convergence where everybody will want to talk the same way. And this is important, for example, in social mobilizations, collective mobilizations like Occupy Vancouver. Occupy Vancouver is right now so diverse that there is no common thread. And for social movements to mobilize beyond that, they need to find that point of convergence where diversity can coexist and where they can move forward from being a collective action process to being a policy-oriented policy action process. Thank you.
A variety of very interesting comments about reflecting on one's own role here in working with a view of diversity on engaging with others and trying to address environmental issues. We also heard people reflect on things about working with others, how to engage others, how to inspire them, and how to work with them and balance that tension that Raul nicely put out for us, which is what is the point of convergence between really finding affinity and shared language and passion, but also making space for diversity of views. I'll like to broaden the frame just a moment. And we talked here quite a bit about ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, language diversity, I'd like to also include, and Claudia mentioned this, around gender diversity. What does it mean to have leaders of both genders or all genders? And around diversity of sectors as well. I don't know about you, but when I go to environmental events, a lot of the time everybody is from progressive organizations and they arrived on their bike. And if we're really going to be having these kinds of conversations to truly make change, what does it look like to have people from the business sector and other kinds of sectors in our conversations? So anyway, so I just want to expand the notion of diversity a little bit for us in our mind. And I'd now like you, in a moment, to turn to the person beside you and spend a moment reflecting on what we just heard. And I have two questions for you, and I'll write them up on the board so you can refer to them. But the first question is, just really simply, what stands out to you about what you just heard? You just heard 5 people speak from very interesting experiences. What stands out to you about what you just heard? And then the second question is, what information would you need to get clearer on the issue of using diversity as a way to mobilize people or considering diversity in our efforts to mobilize people towards environmental outcomes? So I'll write those 2 up on the board. The first one is just what stands out to you about what you heard, what's one thing, 1 or 2 things. And the second is what more information would you need to actually get better at doing this? I'll put those up on the board. Please meet in groups of 2 or 3, and you'll have about 7 to 10 minutes. We'll see how the conversation goes. Okay? So you can share either of the answers to either of those questions. And it can be something that you yourself said or something that you heard someone else say in your group, and you're like, hey, that's actually really neat, and I want to make sure that others in the room know about this. So that's what I'm going to invite you to do in a minute. And panelists, what I'm going to ask you to do is to listen to what's being said and to make some notes about some things that, particularly questions that you feel like you can add some input onto, or ideas that came up that you could deepen by some reflection. So we'll hear a little bit from folks in the room, and then we'll hear back from you guys. So I'd like to invite you, our participants who are here today, to tell us a little bit about give us an insight into the conversation that you just had. What are some of the things that you talked about? And someone has to go first.
I have 3 students of mine right here.
One of you like to go? And I'll pass the microphone over to allow recording to gather people's voices. And I'll just say, even though, so I am going to be passing everyone the mic, but this doesn't mean that you now have 5 minutes to talk. Just what we're looking for is just to highlight one or two the interesting things you guys talked about.
How do I put this? I just think that there are some issues, I guess, that just transcend culture and diversity in general. Like just that if something is unsustainable in the long run, then maybe that's just what needs to be said. And like, as much as it might seem culturally insensitive, that's not the aim of the motion that might be necessary. So what I'm thinking is if something is unsustainable, the fact that it would be culturally insensitive to change it might not be the most important thing. Like the sustainability might be more important than the cultural sensitiveness. So I guess the information we would need is, how long do we have to change this, and is it necessary to change it? And if it is, then maybe that's just what needs to be done.
That's a really interesting point about kind of how do we prioritize. Right. And then I would add a second layer onto that point around, so if we do prioritize sustainability over culture, and I think a good example is the shark fin soup question, then what does that mean to work with a group of people who own that culture? And how do we play with resistance and being open to messaging and stuff? So I'll put that question out there. What else? What else did we hear you guys talk about?
I mean, responding.
I'm sorry. What was your name? Amal. Sorry,
Hi, I'm Carvin, and I mean, responding directly to what he said, and also what you've added on, it's a really difficult issue because the owner of that culture would feel as though it's complex, and it is complex because maybe certain changes of habit may not necessarily need to take place if another culture decides to make another compromise. And so fingers can be pointed, right? It would definitely have to be, framed in a really culturally sensitive way in which cultures know that together we're making compromises as human beings, as opposed to your culture needs to like step up on this, and your culture is making everybody else's culture like unhappy. So I think it's really important to frame it that way.
Right, and we've seen that actually on the international front. When we're talking about climate change and greenhouse gas reductions, the first world nations that we live in say to developing nations, well, you guys have to not drive cars. Well, wait a minute. You had 50 years of everybody living this very wealthy life. So what are you going to do? And so I think that there's, that kind of, how do we work together across cultures, however we define the cultures, whether it's nationalities, ethnicities, languages, and really think through, how do we all own a piece of that question? That's a really good point. Shireen.
Hi, thank you, panel speakers. It was really great to hear from you. I am responding to both of what you just said, that I think it's maybe dangerous to remove culture from the idea of sustainability. Often we remove humans from the environmental context as if we don't belong on this planet. And I think that if we are to move forward, it's dangerous to make statements that we are going to prioritize one over the other, because they're very much integrated. And I think that stops the conversation almost, because as we heard, it's taken as an attack. So I would love to get to this second question of how do we make this clear? How do we move forward? What is it that we need to actually affect change? So I just reposed the question.
Any sort of question answers to that question?
Well, I think it's to not prioritize, I guess, and it's to connect the two. I think that's what this is really about, is making the connections, and maybe looking at all of the issues, and within those issues, there's often reasons that they all exist at the same time. It's because they're all related. So prioritizing is not, I think, a very good or effective way of inducing change.
Thanks.
Can I just make a statement about that?
Sure.
I think when a big chunk of our planet is going hungry, and they are on a day-to-day survival basis of getting their very basic needs met, that the environment is the last thing on their agenda. And so it's and a lot of environmental devastation is happening in developing countries where people are going hungry and they're not getting their needs met. It's, and of course a lot of environmental devastation is happening here in North America where we've already done the damage, but when I, for instance, was in Nicaragua, the turtles are endangered, they're going extinct, the larger turtles. And the locals poach the eggs and sell them for a high price to tourists because they're as a delicacy. And there is environmentalists there working to educate them. Except the root of the problem is, that they're still going hungry, and they're going to do whatever they need to do to meet their daily needs and to feed their family, because humans are still animals and they're still instinctual.
So how do we take that example to help inform working around diversity?
Right, and so that's what I'm just, I'm just saying, the cultural connection there. I mean, one of the things they say is well, we've been doing this for thousands of years. This is our tradition. Like, who are you to come in and tell us not to do it? And we're hungry, and we're going to get a fair price for what we're selling. So it's very complicated, and especially when people are going hungry.
Right. So that's one of the themes actually that I heard both in that important comment and what we've talked about here, is that the issues are deeply interconnected. And so when we pull on one string, what bunches up somewhere else? So I'm curious about this piece, the second question that Shireen, sort of did a call out. What was when you talked about this, what information do you need to get clearer on working with issues of diversity and collective mobilization? What are some of the things you talked about?
Well, I was just in the back here talking with Jess and Morgan. We were really interested in some of the comments that Audrea made about media, and about, I guess, this idea about what kinds of news is newsworthy. And from what I got from her insights were that what's newsworthy is oftentimes things that we think that affect us on an everyday level or a very intimate, personal level. But I wanted to bring in this idea. I think I would like to know what you guys think, and maybe what Audrea thinks too, is I guess this idea of responsibility for, I guess, reporting on things that might not immediately seem newsworthy. Like, where does the boundary lie between, what is seen as newsworthy and what is not, and what but should be reported on anyways? And also, I guess I'm curious to know if Audrea or anyone has noticed if there's a difference between what might seem newsworthy for one community over another. And if that's something that we can sort of play into and use for our advantage.
Great, thank you. Okay, so that's definitely a question to help us think about what would help us get stronger. And I'll just say that we will come back to the rich discussion that just got started and that we talked about, and sort of how do you play with that tension about culture and ownership, and we'll come back to that. But I also want to just make sure we get all the issues out before we move forward. So groups that we haven't heard from.
Hi, I'm Maggie. We have a discussion on both of the questions. The point we want to make is, even though there's a lot of diversities, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, or food choice diversities, but there are always common areas which can join us together. So to to achieve the sustainability goals, we need to find those common areas first. So that would be the energy that area we should spend our energy. Second, I think is about engaging the community, how to engage Chinese communities more like broadly. I mean, the challenge is that there are a group of people, they have their own sustainable principle of living. They said, I never like for myself, for example, I never eat any shark soup. I eat very healthy, so I'm basically on a sustainable living track. So why I should be engaged? I don't have desire, right? I can stick on my own principles. So I think actually these are the kind of group, they're not resist to the sustainability, but they just lack of energy or enthusiasm to be engaged or to play a bigger role in the communities, I think.
Yeah, and actually, so before Maggie give it back, I mean, I'll just recap what I heard in that question, which is sort of how do we make it attractive for people to participate? We heard that question, but how do you get people out to the garden? How do you make it attractive for people to participate when it doesn't make sense? Doesn't say, this is my life. I don't see it. So let's capture that as a question to respond to. And while you have Mike anyway, Maggie was a Greenest City Scholar with the City of Vancouver this year, and she did some research on engaging the Chinese community and the City of Vancouver's efforts to have the greenest city in the world. You were telling me today about just a couple of the findings that you found, and because it's research and it's interesting to base our work on research, would you just give us a highlight of that work?
Okay, so my research, I did the research through two ways. One is I did a survey among Chinese communities, and there's some, in the end, within a month I got 100 responses about, and also did some interview. So there are several findings which I think are very striking. First is we asked the questions about the Chinese people's understanding to green, the word green, and I found the answers are so comprehensive, like almost all the advanced terms we have been discussed. So I think it's fairly well comparable to the general, to the level of understanding of general population. So the conclusion I made is Chinese people, immigrants here, they have very good understanding about the concept of green. But in terms of their understanding to the policy terms, there's 10 greenest city goals. So we pick up some key words from these goals and to ask people to rate their understanding, and then we found understanding is not so good. So by saying that means on the one side, the people, they have their own intuitive understanding of green or of sustainability, but on the other hand, they have less understanding about the policy initiatives. So there's a gap between there. It seems policymakers or the public, they're not talking about the same language, or not, or at least not have a common understanding about the goals. So that's one issue. The other, we also, another question, and also the participation of the planning process of the Greenest City Action Plan in the past 2 years. The Chinese communication is pretty low, very low, I would say. So I think in the end, the recommendation I made is that considering the demographic change, there should be more people from the ethnic culture working in the area, because just as I just said, right, they have a better understanding about how to talk with the people. So I did the survey. I used simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese and English. I did the survey and got 100 responses in 1 month. But after that, I heard the city, they are doing another survey. Even they translated in Chinese, but they didn't get many response. I mean, sometimes you really need the people from this culture to outreach more audience.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so what we heard about just a little bit there was when we have a shared issue, which is becoming the greenest city in the world, then how do we make sure we're hearing from all voices? So other groups we haven't heard from yet. Do you want to share what you were talking about?
So just to kind of jump right to the second question, what information do we need to get clearer on this issue? We kind of talked about 3 main questions. The first of which kind of relates into what she was just speaking about is like, also when that kind of cultural representation is required to get the answers to the problems, how do you bring in those communities if you don't already have that representation established? And so how can you better connect with a more diverse community in kind of whatever it is that you're working on? And so when you look around a room and you see that only certain groups are represented, how do you represent a more diverse community? So that was one of our main questions. Second one is, how do you kind of create that first step before engagement? So in order for people to become involved and to become engaged, there has to be some sort of a catalyzing experience point, some form of education, information, whatever it might be, and how do you kind of build upon that? Because once people are engaged, then it's really easy from there on. Once people are passionate about an issue, they care about it, they're engaged in some form, then it's easy. But how do you kind of create that catalyst for change? And then lastly, I think it has already been pretty much talked about, is how do you cause people to look internally into their own actions to create change without having that come across as criticism. And I think that's a broad issue within sustainability in itself, because all of the solutions for climate change and for other environmental problems need change in some sense, whether it's in what you eat, in how you clothe yourself, and how you transport yourself, and how you live. All of those require changes to your personal preferences. And so how do you bring those about in either a culturally sensitive way or just sensitive to anything without it coming across as just blatant criticism?
Good questions. So we've heard from all the groups. Are there any kind of burning last comments or questions people want to put forward before we hear from the panel? Okay, well, we'll get another chance to hear from you guys, and we'll kind of open up to a bit more of a conversation format. But so just maybe for the purposes of simplicity, we'll just go down the line and just reflect back on 1 or 2 of the issues that came up.
I think for me, some of the issues that have come up is figuring out what those talking points are with each culture. And I think we have to recognize that they are different for each culture. I mean, even within the Chinese community, you're talking the Cantonese-speaking community. I mean, and understanding that there are different talking points for each of those communities. Within the Indo-Canadian culture, for example, we can use the issue of health in relation to diabetes and obesity, because those are very big issues within that community. So for me, to try and frame people to try and change their, for example, their food choices, their shopping habits, choosing more local, using the health and diabetes lens as a way of getting into that culture is generally what the way I would go about it. The other issue, or the other thing that really needs to be done, is finding those champions within the community, because those are the people who will help enable the participation from that community. Like, even for myself, I'm not Punjabi speaking Indo-Canadian, I'm Gujarati speaking, and so I can't speak to the Punjabi Sikh community. I need to find someone in that community to be that champion. And so it takes time, but when you find that person, they're an amazing catalyst for change. So I think a lot of the work a lot of organizations have to realize they need to make those connections and network within the community before they can kind of go out and blast these messages for change.
Yeah, so Arzeena and I had a little chat. We were just talking about, what's newsworthy. She asked that question, and how do we engage people, and what has been my experience with having events. And one of the biggest things and why I feel like I've gotten to as much success as I have, is that really key for me has been relationship building, and it's important. Especially when we're talking about cross-cultural communication, and, you know, being able to create a message that invites people in is definitely relationship building and having key relationships in your community and gaining the trust of people and having them want to engage. And then the other thing that we just were mentioned is that it's generation. There's a huge generational gap. So being multicultural, working with multicultural in a multicultural context with youth is a lot easier because they're English. A lot of them are English speaking. They're in high school. Some of the schools are taking on a lot of green initiatives. Like David Thompson High School right now has a green team, and they just did like a lip dub, and they're challenging other schools to be green as well. So if we can work with groups like that, then they can help to educate maybe the non-English speaking. So I really think empowering our youth is really important, because I think a lot of our youth have a very important message, and they deserve to be heard. And it's not so much the older people's future anymore. It's the youth. It's their future that is being shaped right now by the environmental choices we make. And the other thing I really feel is really important is that change begins with us. That it's when we begin to change ourselves and then work with grassroots initiatives or join bigger organizations, that we're an inspiration to other people, that other people want to get on board. So really, I mean, it all starts right here. And if we want to see change in the world, and we want other people to get on board with our vision or whatever it is they're doing, it's, you can't just be out there fighting. We got to start, making positive changes, individual changes with who we are as people, and look at whether or not we're somebody that other people want to be like, So I think that's also really important.
Thank you. And Raul, I think Claudia needs to go. Is that true? Do you need to?
It's okay.
Well, we can switch the order if you want to go next. Would that be useful for you?
No, it's fine. No? Go ahead. Okay. So Arzeena touched on something that resonates with me really strongly around building champions from within the community. At the end of the day, what we go home to is, like your friends and your family usually, if you're lucky to have that. And that means having, usually your culture, oftentimes your ethnic culture. And so if that's what is kind of the foundation of your understanding of the world, it's important to build champions from within those communities to carry out that message. So Maggie touched on this as well with her survey work, is that you really need more Chinese outreach coordinators to get Chinese people to do surveys. And so in terms of engaging that and how to get them motivated to get involved is one, acknowledge the work that they might be doing that might not be seen in the mainstream community as something that's environmentally sustainable. So for example, I realized this when I told my parents, I was like forcing them to recycle and compost and all this stuff, and they're looking at me funny because they said, yeah, we've been doing this for generations. What are you talking about? Like, our grandparents were farmers. Like, didn't you know this? And so that was me being naive in the sense that, like, oh, I wasn't acknowledging what they've already done. So giving them some sense of ownership. And second, listen to their needs. Because as Audrea mentioned, what resonates with most people is their day-to-day needs. And I think using this idea, as fluffy as it sounds, storytelling to really connect on values and not preach is a way to build connections within a community. So that's the aspect around champions. The second thing that was brought up was around this idea of social issues. So Tricia brought this up when, how are people expected to care about recycling or, any of these issues when, all they're concerned about is their day-to-day survival. So when we do environmental work, we have to be very conscious of the social history, dynamics around social justice issues. And so for me, I was very lucky to be a part of this group called Next Up, which is a social environmental leadership program. And it gave me a lot of anti-oppression training, which helped me understand dynamics and go to do my work in a place with good intentions. And so that's one aspect of environmental work that I think is often overlooked. And that is, that relates to the Chinese community a lot as well. And the third thing is, how do you support these champions? I think financially, having dollars to support groups or individuals to carry forth initiatives is important. But more than that, giving them the space to do that and the autonomy to carry out their work. So it's one thing to say, hey, you should help us carry out this work to tell people to stop eating shark fin. And it's another thing to say, hey, what do you think we should do to get people to stop eating shark fin? And so when you're posing the second question to individuals, they're more willing to engage because they're able to give their own input and that sense of ownership. So, yeah.
I'm happy to go last. If you want me to go now. I'm the only male, so I suppose I should.
Okay, if you want to conclude, I can go first.
Either works.
Raul, why don't you go?
Okay.
Sure, why not? So, the one thing that there were two things that struck me. One was the conversation around gaps. And there is definitely a gap between policymakers and community. And that is actually not diverse. That is actually quite generalized. The challenge in creating collective mobilization when there's such a gap is bridging, finding ways to bridge both worlds, the policymaking world and the community world. And the best way to do that is to have serious conversations like these where the policymakers can actually be closer to communities. So this is one of the ways I think we can work. Also, one thing that was not commented and I noticed, it's age diversity. And I think we are very politically correct to never talk about age. But the reality is that mobilization strategies are completely age dependent. Because much as people don't want to admit it, the way you engage with people that are senior is completely different to the people in the youth. And the tools that you use are completely different. And tools that you use when you have people who have access to the internet, people who don't have access to the internet, that creates it increases the degree of complexity of the mobilization phenomena by 2, because it's not only diversity by age, but it's also diversity by means of outreach. So what we need to recognize is that there will be, you'll have to create these little matrices that where your mobilization strategies will be dependent on who you're trying to target, what age group, and whether they have good online or offline literacy. Because not everything, and I know that Susanna works a lot in online, I work a lot in the online space, but not everything is online. A lot of people do not actually have Facebook, and a lot of people do not use social media. So not every way of engaging, and this is also very culturally dependent. I mean, you'll see rates of adoption of online participation also depend a lot, not only on age, but also on ethnic background. Mm-hmm. So don't forget it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about newsworthiness, as all of you have mentioned. I guess with every journalist, or different media outlets, they would have, or even for the general public, they would have different opinions on what is considered as newsworthy. And for myself, I've done some stories that is not considered as newsworthy, and turn out there'll certainly be audiences that will be attracted to these new information that I'm giving to them. But at the same time, if there would also be some other audiences that they're just not interested, no matter whichever way you package a story, they would just not be interested. Mm-hmm. And so you might want to get to know the media outlet, know the journalist. If you have something to picture them, effective pitching sometimes is very important. Or you might want to look at the newscasts or the different programs that they have, and in the long run, they would sort of they would have a very balance of what people concerned about. And as for environmental story, I'm not an environmental journalist, and if you go look for some environmental journalist story, I believe that there will be a lot of stories that maybe the impact is more long-term, and it could be like in a very geographically distant area, but they will still go and report it because this is their job, right? And when it comes to daily news reporting, and you look at different media outlets, they have different audiences, viewers, readers, and listeners, right? And they will have to target to their audience so they don't lose them. Like when it comes to environmental stories, like I recently done one, and it will be broadcasted on Monday, and I try to tie it with. It is actually about two filmmakers who are very passionate about environmental issues. So I try to tie environmental issue with the filmmaker's journey, about the challenges that they have encountered while they travel long distance. One traveled to China and the other traveled to the Arctic. And so it was those footages that I think my audiences might be interested in, because these are the footages that they just don't see. This is possibly in front of the television, is the only opportunity to see, I would say. And this is how I tied environmental issue with something that I think I would be able to attract my audiences, so they would be interested in like some environmental issues that they have never heard about. But like, yeah, so if you have like a good story to pitch, just get to know the media outlet, know the journalist, and it's the journalist's job to try to put out balanced reporting, right? And they will try to look at different voices and give voice to whoever deserves to be heard, or the voices that hasn't been heard. Yeah.
I have a particular question for you, just because we're talking about tactics, and we talked about how it's really important to be able to outreach through communities. When you have, say, a group that's not currently working with the Chinese community and wants to reach out to them, what's the best way to bridge that cultural gap, do you think?
If they
say they
have
reaching
media?
Yeah,
like,
so they have no substantial relationship with the Chinese community in Vancouver, and know that they need to, and they come to you. What would you need from them to make it relevant to your constituency?
They have no connection to Chinese community in Vancouver.
Yeah, but they know, like they think they should, but they don't yet.
Okay, because our audiences, they come from China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, a lot of them. So it is something that would tie to the places that a lot of our audiences are coming from. It relates to those places that our viewers would be able to connect. Then, like, we would certainly be interested in exploring how would we be able to package a story. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as I just mentioned earlier, the filmmaker story, which has like the one filmmaker, he traveled to China, so this is like how I pitched to my news director too. And the filmmaker's journey is something that a lot of us would not be able to hear about it. It has nothing to do with the Chinese community in Vancouver, but like this is the way I feel that, like, because it is something that most of my viewers would not be able to experience other than in my documentary. So this is the way I want to put it. Mm-hmm. But other journalists might work differently, and other news editor, other news director may think differently. So you will have to get to know them, and if you're interested, like, you can look up like different media outlets, right? And you can get the story, get the information that you want to get.
Right. So I heard three things from you. One is get to know the journalists and start to build a relationship. Secondly, think about how your story might, what angle relates to the lives of the readers. And thirdly, do you have something compelling that would transcend culture, that would make the story newsworthy? So we have just a few more minutes, and I'm not sure, do the panelists have anything burning that they want to say? Or can we turn it over to the participants and see if they have any respondents? Things to respond to? Panelists, do you have something you're like, I really got to make sure we get this in?
Yeah, I'd like to hear from them. Yeah.
Okay. So you just heard a bunch of things. If you're going to go home today and talk to your roommate or get on the phone and call a friend, what's the thing that stands out to you here? And what's the thing that's not yet settled? Because there is actually a ton that's not yet settled. We just barely scratched the surface. And the idea is here to start to kind of formulate that a bit.
My question's for you. So we reach out to journalists, and I guess I was wondering if it's, I'm surely you guys are really, really busy, and so I'm just thinking like how does one work in trying to bridge the connections through brainstorming? Like, for example, if it's something to do with an area that's not close to Asia, about an issue that, for example, the Chinese community don't think they have, then can there ever be a point in which we can just, as you have said, transcend culture? Can we easily just say it's about human rights and try to pitch that as newsworthy, and how does that work?
Well, it depends on different media outlets and different journalists, and there are a lot to talk about in an editorial meeting, and we consider a lot of things, right? And if you, so you will have to, sometimes the journalists, they can see the point right away, and they will, they're actually happy that you are providing a story idea to them too, because we need story ideas too, right? And so if you can just, I would still say you will have to get to know the media outlets and get to know the journalists, and just try to be honest, I would say. And because as journalists, we want to know what is really happening out there. We don't really want to be used by other people too. So just try to be honest and tell us what you found that is, why you think this is something that you think the general public should be aware of. And sometimes journalists can see the point, right? And they will actually be better than you because they know their audiences, and they will be able to package a story that is going to, the message will be going out to their audiences.
Thank you. Thank you. Other kind of thoughts that stick with you? Questions that sort of, well, how does this work? How are we actually going to do this?
I'm not sure it is politically correct to mention this, but when we talk about diversity, racial linguistic area of studies, which is very good, issues, nationality, sectors, ages, and gender. I'd like to add one more, religion, because that's another very diverse, complicated, controversial area as well. Why I'm saying that, because I belong to a Christian organization promoting environmental awareness. And I found that it's very difficult, even within the Christian communities itself. So, but I think it will be worthwhile to look into this as a group as well, because or as an area, because even within the religious communities, Hindus or Muslim, they would have their own driving force for them to look into this issue, and this shape values. And then value is much more things that we have to talk about changes, lifestyle, things like that. So I just want to raise that.
Really, really good point. And I'm actually going to use that as our summary thought, because I know we're getting to the end of the time that we have scheduled. But I want to invite people to stick around if they feel like they've got more to talk about. If they have questions for the panelists. If panelists can stay, please do stay. And so I'll use that point of kind of, you were talking about how you're part of a religious community, and you see yourself as being able to host conversations there. And I think that's one of the most probably powerful things that we can take away from this conversation, is the idea about, if we really want to make change in a community, the change has to come from within that community. And we need to identify champions that can speak the same language and have, and I don't mean dialect, I mean same values, at least have the same framework of values to speak from. And so identifying those champions means looking at ourselves and saying, what communities am I a part of? And how can I become a champion for my community? Whether it's my geographic community, my religious community, my linguistic community. And so that's one role we can play. Another is to, I really liked how you put it, Azira, is to raise the question. And it's not for us to tell other communities what to do, but instead to point something out. And so can we be question raisers? And can we go and talk to people that we may not know very well and may not have a lot of cultural context with, but say, this is an issue I think we're struggling with. And I can't remember who said it, but one of our panelists said, and then to be able to, I think it was Claudia who left, to enroll people in, and what should we do about it, and how should we address this issue, and to not say we need to do this, but to say, hey, there's this problem, and to really open it up, because only within a cultural community or any kind of community does the right way forward emerge. And then lastly is to kind of be the change that, you know, that we ourselves, if we start to make those kinds of changes happen, I'm just reflecting back what I heard, that's actually a very powerful thing, and people will be attracted to that and want themselves to start to participate. So those are just sort of like 3 ways of thinking about our role. And then one last thing I'll say about diversity, and the reason why it's so integral around sustainability issues in particular, is because we do not yet know how to create a sustainable society. It's not like one cultural group's figured it out or one sectoral group has figured it out and we're just waiting for everybody else to catch on. If that was the case, we would have done it 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's a very complex issue. And in fact, our diversity is our strength in figuring out how to tackle this complexity. Because it's not about just technology, it's not just about purchasing patterns, it's about organizations, it's about everything. It's all connected into each other. And that complexity really requires some creative thinking, and being able to tap into our diversity will be our way forward in figuring out a more sustainable society. So I just want to take a moment to thank and acknowledge, I want to make sure I get your acronym right, ACCO, for putting this event together. And this is only the first of a 3-part series. The next part is talking about issues around sexuality or sexual orientation, better, LGBTQT discussion. And then there's a 3rd one about civic engagement and how do those things help influence collective mobilization. So thanks very much, everyone, and please give yourselves a round of applause for participating.